This weekend, we're going to see an election where democracy itself may be on the line. It's in a country that is a powerhouse of its continent, both economically and geographically, with a history of both being colonized and colonizing others, and a history of slavery and westward expansion that exploited natural resources while displacing and killing indigenous peoples. Then, it became a melting pot for immigrants around the world. But its right-wing populist president is threatening to cling to power even if the votes show he lost. His closing message focuses on presenting a vision of his country rooted in Christianity, standing for big business growth and police, and against things like socialism and abortion. No, we're not doing the 2020 election over again, and no, we ain't talking about midterms. This isn't even in the US. We're talking about Brazil, and what its upcoming election could foreshadow about the future of democracy both in the US and abroad. Brazil has a runoff election happening Sunday, pitting right-wing President Jair Bolsonaro against a left-wing candidate who is a familiar face for many Brazilians, former President Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva, Lula for short. In the first part of elections, Lula won more votes, but Bolsonaro had a stronger than expected showing. And with neither candidate crossing the 50% vote threshold, the election now goes to a runoff. Lula is still favored to win, but polling has proved less than reliable so far. But things might get murky from there. Bolsonaro's coalition is still expected to control majorities in both chambers of Brazil's National Congress, and it's unclear whether Bolsonaro will actually give up power. He's already spread false allegations about secret vote counting and rigged voting machines, leading to high levels of mistrust in the electoral process. Bolsonaro has already said he won't accept a result that isn't a win and laid out some objectively morbid alternatives.
We have three alternatives, especially for me: jailed, killed, or victorious. I say to the scoundrels that I will never be jailed.
Brazil also has a history of coups, including a military dictatorship that ruled for more than 2 decades until 1985. And Bolsonaro kinda has a thing for that era. "I'm in favor of a dictatorship," Bolsonaro said in a 1993 speech, years after democracy was instituted. He wanted Brazil to follow the path of then Peruvian President Alberto Fujimori. Fujimori pulled a self-coup using the military to close Congress and the federal judiciary and give all 3 branches of government to himself, the president. Bolsonaro told the New York Times, also in 1993, "I sympathize with Fujimori," and that the self-coup approach was the way out for Brazil at the time. And he's still spoken glowingly about Brazil's dictatorship era over the past decade. When voting to impeach former President Dilma Rousseff in 2016, he dedicated his pro-impeachment vote to a colonel who had led a torture unit in the dictatorship era. Rousseff used to be a guerrilla fighter and was one of those tortured. While campaigning for president in 2018, he told NPR he thought the dictatorship was a very good era for Brazil. And in office, Bolsonaro has brought back annual celebrations of the coup that put the military into power, focusing on the military's role in fighting communism. But when he first ran for president, he said if a military official takes power, it should be via voting rather than a coup. However, those comments didn't mention what would happen if it came down to staying in power. So if Brazil has its own version of the 2020 election, or a Capitol riot, or a coup, what does it mean for the US? First of all, the US has a potential role here. President Biden has already made promoting democracy at home and abroad a priority, and the Biden administration can apply pressure. Threats of sanctions or loss of economic opportunities could lead big businesses pushing Bolsonaro to avoid taking the most drastic measures to retain power. And on the other hand, lessons from Brazil could quickly be imported from Bolsonaro to the American right. Former President Donald Trump offered a personal endorsement for Bolsonaro, a rarity in a world where political leaders don't usually make international election endorsements. Former Trump advisor Steve Bannon and former Trump spokesperson Jason Miller have vocally campaigned for Bolsonaro online. And Fox News host Tucker Carlson went to Brazil earlier this year for a meeting and a favorable televised interview with Bolsonaro. We want to bring somebody into this conversation who has seen a lot of this firsthand and has spent years seeing what's happening in Brazil. Joining us now is Nick Zimmerman. He's a global fellow at the Brazil Institute, part of the public policy think tank, the Wilson Center. He was also an Obama administration appointee, serving as a senior policy advisor to the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and as the director of Brazil and Southern Cone Affairs at the White House National Security Council. Nick, I think this means you know your stuff on this issue, so thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Our segment has shown how similar Brazil's political system and history are to the United States. But what are the key differences we should keep in mind as Brazil tackles its own democracy issues?
Sure, a lot of similarities, but a lot of differences. I like to refer back to a former presidential candidate and a former environment minister to articulate some of the differences. Her name is Marina Silva. She placed in third in 2014. On the left, a green policy environmentalist who's also a deeply religious evangelical. These boxes just don't fit in the same way in the political spectrum in the United States. It's a very, very large country. It has a lot of regional differences, not unlike the United States. So a lot of the dynamics are similar, but when you really get into the nuances and the details, this is a country with a rich history. It's rich on culture, and that applies to politics too.
One of the things that we cover in the segment here is how President Bolsonaro and President Trump have formed a close bond. This is something that really plays into this idea that, maybe there are some similarities here. What about Brazil's voting population makes it so easy for the so-called Trump playbook to translate in Brazil?
Listen, I think that we're seeing the surge of populism across the political ideological spectrum surge in most of the major democracies in the world, and Brazil is certainly that. It's the fourth largest democracy in the world. And I think we've seen how social media, the propagation of political disinformation can really start to change political perceptions in any number of countries. You mentioned Trump in the United States, and I think we've seen the same thing in Brazil. I'm not sure that it's relatively speaking easier for that type of a message to be amplified in Brazil than it is in any number of countries, but it certainly seems symptomatic of what's going on there, as well as in any number of the world's leading democracies, whether we're talking India, the UK, or the United States.
We've underscored how these elections will affect Brazil's democracy. But Brazil's economy is a key difference maker in where the global climate crisis heads. How will this election affect the global picture for fighting climate change?
I believe that the upcoming election is the most important in the world this year precisely because of this question. There's a very, very stark difference between what we can expect in Amazon conservation policy, the broader approach to environmental issues, depending on who is the president in Brazil starting in 2023. Deforestation rates have skyrocketed under Bolsonaro. It's important to note that they were on the rise before he became president. This is not a problem that starts with him, but it's really deteriorated in rapid fashion over his first term. And he has every political incentive to keep up with that. Ironically, or perhaps not ironically, some of the areas where he has registered the strongest support in the first round of the voting was in the Amazon. So we can expect more of the same on that front from him if he's reelected. But alternatively, Lula has really spoken quite strongly about the need for Brazil to return to its traditional position as a leader in the global climate change fight, and that he takes this issue very seriously. If he were to be elected, I think you'll see a return to a more proactive, serious global climate change negotiating partner. And you'll also see increased levels of monitoring and enforcement from the federal government to reduce rates of deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon basin.
Nick Zimmerman is a global fellow at the Brazil Institute, part of the public policy think tank, the Wilson Center. Nick, thank you so much for your time and your expertise, my man.
Thanks for having me, man.